What happens when a talk show host with a sharp tongue picks a fight with a Hollywood legend who's faced down every challenge? On the set of The Late Show, Stephen Colbert thought he could outwit Clint Eastwood, but he was about to learn that some battles aren't won with smug grins and cheap shots. The air crackled with tension as the two men squared off, their voices sharp enough to cut through the applause. This wasn't just a chat gone wrong. It was a showdown, raw and unscripted, with egos bigger than the screen Eastwood had ruled. For decades, Colbert leaned forward in his chair, his eyes glinting with that familiar mix of mockery and menace. He'd invited Eastwood to talk about his latest film, a gritty western that had critics buzzing. But instead of questions about the movie, Colbert launched into an attack. He accused Eastwood of churning out films for profit, not passion, claiming his work lacked the soul of true art. The audience gasped, sensing the shift from banter to something darker. Colbert's words dripped with disdain, each one a jab at Eastwood's legacy. He called him a relic, a man coasting on old glories, more businessman than artist. The crowd murmured, uneasy but hooked, as Colbert's voice rose, taunting Eastwood to defend himself. Eastwood sat still, his weathered face unreadable, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. He'd faced critics before, from dusty saloons to polished boardrooms, and he wasn't about to let this slick host tear him down. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, like a storm gathering on the horizon. He asked Colbert what he knew about art, about the sweat and sacrifice of telling stories that last. The question hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in calm. Colbert scoffed, doubling down, saying Eastwood's films were just violence and clichés, pandering to the masses. He leaned closer, his grin sharp, daring Eastwood to prove him wrong. The tension thickened as Eastwood's jaw tightened. He wasn't here to be mocked. He began to push back, his words slow but deliberate, recounting the choices he'd made, the risks he'd taken, to make films that spoke truth. He spoke of nights spent perfecting a scene, of fighting studios to keep his vision pure. The audience leaned in, captivated by the raw honesty in his voice. Colbert, sensing the shift, cut him off, his tone biting. He accused Eastwood of dodging the real issue, of hiding behind his tough guy image to avoid hard truths. The crowd stirred, some booing Colbert's aggression, but he pressed on, his voice loud and unyielding, determined to break Eastwood's composure. Eastwood's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. He wasn't just defending his work now, this was personal. Colbert had crossed a line, turning a discussion into a public humiliation. The host's arrogance, his need to dominate, was clear to everyone watching. Eastwood leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, promising Colbert he'd regret this. The audience held its breath, sensing the fight was far from over. Colbert's smirk faltered for a split second, but he recovered, ready to escalate. The stage was set for a clash that would leave one man standing and the other scrambling to save face. Eastwood's whispered warning hung in the air, a spark ready to ignite the powder keg between him and Colbert. The audience, still reeling from the host's vicious jabs, watched as the Hollywood legend straightened in his chair, his presence commanding the room. He wasn't about to let Colbert's arrogance go unanswered. With a voice like gravel, he began dismantling the host's accusations, each word a precise strike. He spoke of the stories he'd told, of men and women grappling with life's hardest truths, stories that didn't need fancy words to resonate. The crowd nodded, drawn to his conviction, their murmurs turning to cheers as Eastwood's passion filled the stage. Colbert's smirk twitched, his confidence cracking under the weight of Eastwood's words. He shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming the desk, a nervous tick betraying his unease. He couldn't let Eastwood win the crowd. Cutting in, his voice sharp and loud, he accused Eastwood of romanticizing his work, claiming it was just recycled tropes dressed up as wisdom. The attack was personal, aimed at Eastwood's pride, But the legend didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned closer, his eyes locking onto Colbert's, and asked why the host felt the need to tear down what others built. The question landed like a punch, and the audience roared, sensing Colbert's grip on the argument slipping. Desperate to regain control, Colbert stood pacing behind his desk, his movements jerky, his tone venomous. He mocked Eastwood's quiet demeanor, calling it a coward's act, a way to dodge real debate. The crowd gasped at the insult, some shouting in protest, but Colbert raised his voice, drowning them out. He claimed Eastwood's films glorified violence, ignoring the pain they caused, and accused him of profiting off suffering. It was a low blow, twisting Eastwood's legacy into something ugly, and the room grew tense, the air heavy with anticipation. Colbert's aggression was unraveling him, his need to dominate making him reckless. Eastwood remained seated, his calm a stark contrast to Colbert's frenzy. He spoke again, his voice steady but laced with steel, recounting a film he'd made, about war's cost, a story that honored the broken, not the victors. He described the letters he'd received from veterans, people who saw their struggles in his work, and asked Colbert what he'd ever done to touch a soul. The audience erupted, their applause shaking the room, as Eastwood's words exposed the host's shallow attacks. For the first time, Colbert's face flushed, his eyes darting to the crowd, realizing he was losing them. The pivotal moment came when Colbert, cornered and furious, slammed his hand on the desk, shouting that Eastwood was out of touch, a dinosaur who didn't belong on his stage. The insult was a mistake, too raw, too cruel, and the crowd turned fully against him, their boos deafening. Eastwood rose slowly, his height imposing, his voice low and cutting. He told Colbert he didn't need this stage, or any stage, to prove his worth. The audience cheered wildly, their loyalty now with Eastwood, as Colbert stood frozen, his desperation clear. The argument wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and the host's next move would decide how far this battle would go. The boos from the audience still echoed as Stephen Colbert stood behind his desk, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Clint Eastwood's words had turned the crowd against him, and the host's failure to reclaim control burned like a wound. He wasn't done yet. With a forced laugh, sharp and hollow, he pivoted to a new tactic, one designed to cut deeper than before. He turned to the audience, his voice dripping with sarcasm, and asked if they really believed Eastwood's tales of sacrifice. He called the legend a showman, a fraud who spun stories to hide his greed. The accusation was vicious, a deliberate twist of Eastwood's honesty, and the crowd's anger flared, their shouts of protest rising. Eastwood didn't move, his tall frame steady, but his eyes narrowed, glinting with a fire that promised retribution. He'd heard worse in his time, but Colbert's relentless attacks were testing his restraint. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost chilling, slicing through the host's bluster. He asked Colbert why he needed to lie, why tearing down others was the only way he could feel tall. The simplicity of the question stunned the room, and the audience cheered, their voices a wave of support for the man who refused to bend. Colbert's jaw clenched, his plan backfiring as Eastwood's quiet strength exposed his cruelty. Furious, Colbert abandoned any pretense of civility. He stormed around the desk, closing the distance between them, his finger jabbing the air inches from Eastwood's face. He shouted that Eastwood's time was over, that his films were relics no one cared about, and that he was embarrassing himself by clinging to relevance. The words were raw, personal, meant to break Eastwood's spirit. But the crowd recoiled, their boos now a roar, some standing in defiance of the host's tirade. Colbert's recklessness was unraveling him, his need to destroy Eastwood blinding him to the room's shifting tide. Eastwood rose to his full height, towering over Colbert, his presence like a mountain unmoved by a storm. He didn't shout, didn't need to. His voice, low and deliberate, carried a weight that silenced the room. He told Colbert he'd spent his life building something real, something that outlasted petty men with loud mouths. He spoke of the people his work had touched, the truths it had uncovered, and said no one, not even Colbert, could take that away. The audience erupted, their applause thunderous, as Eastwood's words landed like a final blow to the host's crumbling facade. The breaking point came when Colbert, wild with desperation, grabbed Eastwood's arm, yelling for him to admit he was wrong or get off the stage. The move was a mistake, a line crossed that shocked even the most loyal in the crowd. Eastwood pulled free, his glare fierce, and warned Colbert to keep his hands to himself. The tension was electric, the room on edge, as the host realized he'd gone too far. His eyes darted, searching for an escape, but the audience's chants for Eastwood drowned out his voice. The legend stood tall, unbroken, ready for whatever came next, while Colbert's control slipped away, setting the stage for a reckoning. The chants for Clint Eastwood thundered through the studio, a tidal wave of support that left Stephen Colbert stranded in his own domain. His grab at Eastwood's arm had been a fatal misstep, and the crowd's outrage pinned him in place, his face pale with the realization he'd lost them. But Colbert wasn't one to slink away quietly. His pride, bruised and battered, drove him to a final reckless stand. He stepped back, forcing a grin that looked more like a snarl, and raised his hands to quiet the crowd. His voice, strained but loud, cut through the noise as he tried to twist the narrative one last time. He claimed Eastwood had come to his show unprepared, unable to defend his hollow legacy, and that he, Colbert, was only exposing the truth. The audience didn't buy it. Their jeers grew louder, a wall of sound rejecting his lies. But Colbert pressed on, his tone frantic, almost unhinged. He pointed at Eastwood, accusing him of arrogance, of thinking he was above criticism because of his fame. It was a desperate ploy, a last attempt to paint himself as the hero, but the words felt empty, grasping. The crowd's loyalty was with Eastwood, and every eye in the room turned to the legend, waiting for his response. Eastwood stood motionless, his silence more powerful than Colbert's shouting, his weathered face a canvas of resolve that needed no words to speak. When Eastwood finally responded, his voice was like a blade, precise and unyielding. He didn't raise it, didn't need to, as he addressed Colbert directly. He spoke of integrity, of standing by your work when the world doubts you, and asked what Colbert had ever risked for his craft. The question was a mirror, reflecting the host's shallow attacks, and the audience roared their approval, some rising to their feet. Eastwood's words weren't just a defense, they were an indictment, stripping away Colbert's pretense and leaving him exposed. The host's grin vanished, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. Colbert, cornered and unraveling, made his final move. He leaned forward, his voice low but venomous, and told Eastwood to leave, saying the show didn't need guests who couldn't handle tough questions. It was a bold front, but the quiver in his tone betrayed his fear. The crowd gasped, then erupted in boos, their anger now a force of its own. Eastwood didn't budge. Instead, he took a slow step toward Colbert, his eyes locked on the host's, and said he'd leave when he was ready, not when a bully demanded it. The statement was calm, final, and the audience exploded, their cheers shaking the room as Eastwood's defiance towered over Colbert's crumbling authority. The moment was a turning point, the air thick with the weight of Eastwood's victory. Colbert's shoulders slumped, his bravado gone, as he realized no words could undo the damage. The crowd's chants grew rhythmic, a unified call for Eastwood, while the host stood frozen, his stage no longer his own. Eastwood's resolve had broken him, not with fists but with truth, and the path to the end was clear. The legend had one final moment to claim, and the audience leaned in, hungry for the triumph they knew was coming. The studio pulsed with the crowd's chants, a relentless tide of voices lifting Clint Eastwood's name, while Stephen Colbert stood, diminished, on his own stage. His attempt to banish Eastwood had collapsed, his authority shattered by the legend's unyielding presence. The host's eyes flickered with panic, searching for a way to claw back control. But the room belonged to Eastwood now. The audience, on their feet, waited for the final word, their energy a living force that demanded justice. Eastwood, calm, as ever, took a measured breath, his gaze never leaving Colbert, ready to end this battle with the same strength he'd carried through decades of storms. Colbert, grasping at straws, tried one last jab. His voice cracked as he muttered that Eastwood's fans were blind, clinging to a faded star who offered nothing new. The words were weak, a dying gasp of defiance, and the crowd drowned them out with jeers, their loyalty unshakable. Eastwood stepped closer, his boots heavy on the stage, and the room fell silent, hanging on his response. He spoke slowly, each word carved from experience, saying he didn't need to be new, only true. He talked of the people who'd found courage in his stories, of the lives his work had shaped, and said that was worth more than any critic's scorn. The audience roared, their applause a thunderclap as Colbert's face drained of color. Eastwood didn't stop there. He turned the tables, asking Colbert what he'd leave behind, what mark he'd made beyond tearing others down. The question was a blade, cutting through the host's ego, and the crowd's cheers swelled, sensing the kill. Colbert opened his mouth, but no words came, his silence a confession of defeat. Eastwood's voice grew softer, almost pitying, as he told the host to think twice before challenging someone's life's work. It wasn't anger in his tone, but certainty, the kind that comes from knowing your worth. The audience stood taller, inspired, their voices a chorus of triumph for the man who'd faced a bully and won. Colbert sank into his chair, his hands limp, the fight gone from him. He muttered for Eastwood to go, but it was a plea, not a command, and the crowd laughed, their scorn sealing his humiliation. Eastwood shook his head, a faint smile breaking through, and said he'd leave, but not because Colbert wanted it. He walked toward the stage's edge, pausing to face the audience, who greeted him with a standing ovation. He raised a hand, not in victory but in gratitude, and their cheers followed him as he exited, his head high, his legacy untarnished. The camera lingered on Colbert alone, staring at the desk, a man humbled by his own arrogance. Backstage, the crew whispered in awe, already retelling the story of the night Eastwood took down a giant. The audience filed out, buzzing with excitement, their respect for the legend deeper than ever. Colbert's show would go on, but this moment would haunt him, a reminder that some fights aren't worth picking. For the viewers at home, the tale was clear. Eastwood's truth had prevailed, his strength a beacon, proving that real art, real heart, always outlasts a loud mouth. The story ended not with a shout, but with a quiet, unshakable triumph, one that echoed long after the cameras stopped rolling.